The sharp buzz of the security alarm shattered the calm inside Jensen's grocery store. A young man in a gray hoodie sprinted toward the exit, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. His shoes screeched against the tile floor as he pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the crowded street outside. Customers froze, their heads turning toward the commotion. The store manager, Jensen, a bald man with a permanent frown, leapt up from behind the counter. "Hey, stop him!" He shouted, but it was too late. The thief was gone. Standing near the dairy aisle, 72-year-old Martha Lewis clutched her small shopping basket, her fingers gripping the handle tighter. She had seen it happen. The boy had rushed past her, moving fast, eyes darting. But before she could even process it, the situation took a sharp turn. The store security guard, a broad man in a navy uniform, stepped forward. His gaze locked not on the empty door where the thief had escaped, but on Martha. "You," he said sharply. Martha blinked. "What?" The guard advanced toward her, his face full of suspicion. "You were near the aisle when the alarm went off," he said, voice firm. "Empty your pockets." Martha's heart skipped a beat. I didn't take anything," she stammered. "That boy, he ran out. I saw him." The store manager hesitated, glancing between her and the security guard. Then he nodded. "She was standing near the shelf," he muttered. Martha's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "I was just shopping," she said, her voice unsteady. "Look in my basket. There's only bread and milk." But the security guard wasn't listening. He was already reaching for his radio. Martha took a step back. "Please," she said, "check the cameras. You'll see, I didn't." Before she could finish, the store doors swung open again. A police officer entered. And just like that, her nightmare began. The store doors swung open again, and in stepped a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and commanding. Detective Owens, a man known for his quick judgments, scanned the store with a bored expression. His eyes landed on the security guard who was already pointing at Martha. "This woman set off the alarm," the guard said firmly. "She was near the aisle when the theft happened." Martha's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up. A few customers whispered among themselves, some still holding their phones, possibly recording, but no one intervened. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice trembling. "The real thief ran out just now. Check the cameras." Detective Owens didn't ask any questions. He didn't even glance toward the security cameras. Instead, he stepped closer, pulling out a notepad as if the case was already closed. "The store owner says she was near the shelf when the alarm went off," the officer said, writing something down. He looked at Martha, his eyes cold and indifferent. "Do you have any receipts?" Martha clutched her small basket. Inside were only a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. She had planned to pay at the counter, but she hadn't even reached it yet. "I haven't paid yet. I was just—" Owens didn't let her finish. He reached for his cuffs. "You're under arrest for shoplifting," he said flatly. Martha's heart pounded. She took a step back instinctively, but before she could say another word, the officer grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward. "No, please, I just came to buy groceries," she cried, struggling to pull away. But his grip was firm, unyielding. With a practiced motion, he snapped the cold steel handcuffs around her thin wrists. Martha gasped at the tightness. The cold metal bit into her skin, sending a chill down her spine. "Don't resist," Owens warned, tightening the cuffs. Tears welled up in Martha's eyes. "I swear, I didn't steal anything. Check the footage. Ask someone. That boy, he ran right past me." But Owens had already turned her around, leading her toward the exit like she was a dangerous criminal. The customers stood frozen, watching in silence. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet, but no one spoke up. A woman in the back whispered, "That's not right," but no one else agreed. Martha's face burned with humiliation. Was this what her life had come to? Being dragged out of a store in handcuffs over a crime she didn't commit? Outside, the afternoon sun blazed down on the scene. A police car was already parked at the curb. "Officer, please," Martha pleaded one last time, her voice cracking. "I've done nothing wrong." Owens didn't answer. He opened the car door and guided her inside. The last thing she saw before the door shut was the store manager, Jensen, looking away as if he didn't see her at all. The door slammed closed, locking her inside. And as the police car pulled away, Martha felt something she had never felt before in her entire life. Powerless. The police car rolled through the city streets, sirens off. But to Martha, it might as well have been screaming. The weight of the cold steel cuffs around her wrists felt heavier with each passing second. She sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands aching from the tight grip of the metal. The officer driving, Detective Owens, hadn't spoken a word since closing the door. She stared out the window, the familiar streets of her neighborhood blurring past. The same streets she had walked on for decades, raised her children on, built a life on, now felt distant, foreign. Her voice was weak, but she forced herself to speak. "Sir, please, just check the footage. You'll see, I didn't take anything." Owens didn't even turn his head. His eyes stayed on the road, his expression unreadable. "You can tell it to the judge." Martha's stomach twisted. The judge. The car slowed as they approached a large gray building, the police station. The moment the car stopped, Owens stepped out, opened the back door, and yanked Martha out, with little care. She winced as her stiff knees nearly buckled under her. As she was led inside, the air changed. The place smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and something metallic, like rust or dried blood. The sound of phones ringing, officers chatting, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the space. Martha was guided through a set of metal detectors and into a small, cold room with a camera mounted on the wall. "Face forward." A female officer ordered, holding a camera. Martha hesitated. The woman sighed. "Mugshot. Let's go." A bright flash blinded her for a second. Next, they grabbed her hands, pressing her fingertips onto an ink pad before rolling them onto a fingerprint. "Sheet." The officer barely looked at her as he scribbled something onto a form and pushed it in front of her. "Sign here." Martha's hands trembled as she took the pen. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The officer didn't even acknowledge her. Tears stung her eyes as she scribbled her name. The letters blurred, but she finished. After what felt like forever, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue uniform stepped into the room, a clipboard in his hands. His badge read Sergeant Hawkins. He barely glanced up before sighing. "Shoplifting, huh?" he muttered, flipping through the papers. "She was caught at the scene," Owens responded. The store owner didn't see the act, but she was the only one near the shelf when the alarm went off. Martha stiffened. "That's not true," she protested. "I was just getting milk and bread. There was a boy, a young man in a hoodie. He ran out. If you check the cameras." Owen's grip on her shoulder tightened. "Enough," he said in a low, cold voice. Martha felt a shiver run through her. Hawkins shrugged, scribbling something onto the form. "Did anyone check the footage?" Owens let out a casual sigh, shaking his head. "Not yet, but she fits the description." Martha's breath caught in her throat. The thief had been a young man in his 20s, wearing a gray hoodie. Martha was a 72-year-old woman in a blue floral dress. It didn't matter. Hawkins didn't even react. He just kept writing before nodding toward the open doorway. "Take her to processing." Martha tried again, her voice breaking this time. "I didn't steal anything," she pleaded. "Check the cameras. Ask the store owner again, please." Owens ignored her as he led her toward another room. A different officer was waiting. She barely got a glance before being forced to sit. On a metal bench, her cuffs removed and replaced with plastic zip ties. Martha sat there, her wrists aching, staring at the plain gray wall. The room was silent except for the occasional shuffle of another detainee shifting uncomfortably in their seat. Minutes passed, then an hour. Martha's thoughts began to spiral. Would Jamal, her youngest son, even know where she was? He was always busy with work. Would anyone know? Would anyone care? Would she just vanish into the system, forgotten? A door creaked open, the scent of cheap cologne and stale coffee filling the air. A man in a wrinkled suit stepped inside, flipping through a folder in his hands. He barely glanced at her. "Jessica Carter?" he asked without looking up. Martha blinked. "It's Martha," she corrected. The man let out a long sigh. "Right. Martha Lewis." He sat down across from her, tapping his pen against the folder. "You've been charged with shoplifting and resisting arrest." Martha stiffened. "That's not—" "I'm your public defender," he cut in, already moving on as if her innocence or guilt didn't matter. "Your hearing is first thing in the morning." Morning? Martha felt her stomach drop. That meant they were keeping her overnight. She wasn't going home. Panic clawed at her ribs, squeezing tighter with every breath. The room felt smaller, colder. She gripped the edge of the bench, trying to steady herself. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. The lawyer exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "That's what they all say." Martha sat back, her breath shaky. For the first time, it hit her, really hit her. They weren't going to listen. They were going to bury her. She barely slept that night. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead never turned off. The constant echo of voices beyond the walls kept her on edge. She had always believed in the system, believed that truth mattered. But now, she wasn't so sure. As the hours stretched on, she sat in the silence, waiting for morning, waiting for a courtroom that had already made up its mind. The cold, metallic clank of the cell door unlocking jolted Martha from her restless sleep. She had barely closed her eyes, kept awake by the flickering fluorescent lights, the distant murmurs of officers, and the occasional sound of a metal tray scraping against concrete. Her body ached from the hard bench and her head felt heavy, but she sat up as soon as she heard her name. "Martha Lewis," an officer called, standing at the entrance. "Court's in session. Let's go." Her wrists were sore, but that didn't stop them from tightening the zip ties again. She winced as they guided her down a long, dimly lit corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last, dread settling in her stomach like a rock. She was led into a cold, impersonal courtroom with dull gray walls and rows of wooden benches, mostly empty except for a few scattered faces. She looked around. hoping to see a familiar one. But there was no one, no family, no friends. At the front of the room sat Judge Daniel Mercer, an older man with sharp eyes that cut through the space. His expression was unreadable, but Martha could feel it. He had already made up his mind. Her public defender, the same disheveled man from last night, barely looked at her as she was guided to the defendant's table. He sat slumped over, flipping through some papers like her case was just another inconvenience. The prosecutor, a rigid-looking man in a dark suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught at the scene of a shoplifting incident. The arresting officer witnessed her attempting to flee." Martha's head snapped up. "That's a lie. I didn't." A tight grip on her arm silenced her. Her lawyer leaned in, voice low. "Don't talk unless I tell you to." She bit her lip, swallowing her words. Judge Mercer barely looked at her. Instead, he turned his attention to the prosecutor. "Does the prosecution have video evidence?" A brief pause. The prosecutor hesitated before answering. "There is footage, but it hasn't been reviewed yet." Martha's heart pounded. There was footage that would prove she didn't steal anything, that she hadn't resisted, that the real thief had been someone else. She could almost feel the weight of the truth sitting on a hard drive somewhere, unseen, ignored. Judge Mercer nodded as if it didn't matter. "Then we proceed without it." Martha's pulse roared in her ears. Without it? She clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Her lawyer straightened, in his seat, speaking for the first time. "Your Honor, we ask to postpone until the footage is reviewed." Mercer waved a hand dismissively. "Denied. The police had reason to believe she was guilty. We have enough to move forward." Enough. Enough for what? A conviction based on, an officer's word alone? An assumption. Martha felt the walls closing in. Then came the part that made her skin go cold. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Given the defendant's age and lack of stable employment, we request bail to be set at $20,000. Martha's breath caught. $20,000 for a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. She turned to her lawyer, but his expression remained blank, unreadable. He leaned toward her. "Do you have family who can post bail?" Martha exhaled slowly. The chaos in her chest cooled into something sharper, more controlled. A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She lifted her chin. They had no idea. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the courtroom like a blade. "My son," she said, locking eyes with Judge Mercer, "is the U.S. Attorney General." Silence fell like a hammer. The prosecutor's face paled. Judge Mercer's gaze flickered, the first crack in his stony expression. A murmur swept through the small crowd in the courtroom. Martha watched the power shift before her eyes. It was almost laughable how quickly the air changed, how the very people who had dismissed her seconds ago were suddenly considering everything. Judge Mercer cleared his throat. "Is this true?" Her lawyer sat straighter now, suddenly more invested. "Yes, Your Honor. Martha Lewis is the mother of Attorney General Daniel Lewis." A cold sweat broke out on the prosecutor's brow. The judge sat back, his demeanor suddenly more careful. The prosecutor cleared his throat, voice unsteady. "Your Honor, given these new circumstances, we may need to reevaluate the terms of bail." Martha's lawyer, for the first time, smiled. "Your Honor, Given that my client has no criminal history and was merely purchasing food, I move for immediate release on her own recognizance." Judge Mercer's fingers tapped against his desk. He glanced at Martha as if seeing her for the first time. Then, with a heavy sigh, he straightened. "Bail is denied," Mercer said, his voice now filled with caution. "The defendant is free to go. Case dismissed." A stunned silence filled the room before the gavel struck down, final and absolute. Martha stood slowly, the weight of injustice still heavy in her bones. The prosecutor looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The arresting officer, who had sat smugly in the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She turned to leave, the burn of their stares following her outside. The moment she stepped out of the courthouse, a black car was already waiting at the curb. The door opened before she reached it, and her son, Daniel Lewis, stepped out. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "Are you all right?" he asked, scanning her for any signs of harm. Martha smiled faintly. "I am now." Daniel exhaled sharply, then glanced toward the courthouse. "They will regret this." She placed a hand on his arm. "I just want the footage reviewed. Want the truth to be seen." He nodded. "Oh, it will be. And after that, they'll have to answer for more than just this." Martha let the words settle. Justice wasn't always immediate, but it was coming, and this time, she wouldn't be the one left unheard. As Martha stepped outside the courthouse, the warm air felt different against her skin. Not comforting, but heavy. The weight of what had just happened still lingered in her chest, but she kept her head high. She wasn't going to let them see her broken. The moment she reached the curb, the door of a sleek black car swung open, and her son, Daniel Lewis, stepped out. His tall frame radiated authority, but his sharp eyes were filled with quiet fury. He wasn't just angry. He was calculated, controlled, and prepared to do what needed to be done. He scanned her face, searching for any sign of harm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. Martha nodded, offering a small smile. "I am now." Daniel exhaled sharply, but his focus quickly shifted to the courthouse behind her. His jaw clenched. "They will regret this." Martha placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "I don't want revenge, Daniel. I just want the footage reviewed. I want the truth to be seen." He met her gaze, his expression softening, but only slightly. "Oh, it will be. And after that, they'll have to answer for more than just this." Without another word, he gestured for her to step inside the car. As soon as the door shut behind them, the energy inside the vehicle shifted. The moment they pulled away from the curb, Daniel pulled out his phone. His voice was cold, professional, carrying a weight that demanded immediate attention. "This is Daniel Lewis," he said. "I need a team reviewing security footage from Jensen's grocery store immediately. I want every angle, every second, no delays." Martha sat quietly as her son moved swiftly through the system, his power evident in how quickly people responded. She had never seen him like this. Of course, she had always known her son was important, but seeing him wield that influence for her felt surreal. Within minutes, he had multiple people on the line. His legal team, his personal assistant, even, a contact in law enforcement. It was like watching a chess master move pieces effortlessly. As the car wove through the streets, Martha glanced out the window, watching the city blur past. How many people had been through what she just experienced? How many had been accused, dismissed, and forgotten simply because they had no one to fight for them? Daniel ended his last call and turned to her. "I spoke with the police chief. They'll review the footage, but I don't trust them to be thorough. My team will have access to it within the hour." Martha sighed, her hands resting in her lap. "You shouldn't have to do all of this just to prove I didn't steal a loaf of bread." Daniel's jaw tightened. "No, I shouldn't. But this isn't just about proving you're innocent. It's about exposing how quickly they were willing to frame you." Martha held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. She knew he was right. The car came to a smooth stop in front of Daniel's private office building. A sleek, glass-covered structure in the heart of the city, buzzing with people in suits moving with purpose. The moment they stepped inside, a team of lawyers and assistants stood waiting, folders and tablets in hand. A young woman approached, her voice crisp. "Sir, we have the footage." Daniel gave a single nod. "Show me." Martha stood beside him as the screen lit up, showing the inside of Jensen's grocery store. Her heart pounded as the events played out in front of her again. The footage was crystal clear. The young man in the gray hoodie moved quickly through the aisles, stuffing items into his pockets. He was jittery, his eyes darting toward the exit. Then he bolted. The moment he dashed out, the security alarm blared. Martha saw herself in the corner of the frame, calmly picking up her milk and bread, completely unaware of the theft happening just feet away. Then came the worst part, the moment the security guard turned and immediately locked eyes on her. He didn't even hesitate. Daniel let out a slow breath, filled with restrained anger. "There it is," he muttered. "They didn't stop to check. They didn't hesitate to blame you." One of his attorneys adjusted her glasses. "This is damning evidence. The police failed to investigate properly. The store owner made no effort to clarify what happened, and the judge refused to wait for this footage before making a decision." Daniel turned to his mother. "They expected you to disappear, Mom. They thought you had no one." Martha nodded, feeling a deep exhaustion settle over her. But this time, she wasn't just going to walk away. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, we make sure everyone sees this." He turned back to his team. "Prepare a press statement. I want this footage sent to the media, and start drafting formal complaints against Judge Mercer, Detective Owens, and the prosecutor. If there was any coordination between them, we'll find it." Martha watched him work, his mind already 5 steps ahead. She felt a quiet pride settle in her chest, not just because he was her son, but because he had the power to make sure this didn't happen to someone else. Daniel looked at her again. "This isn't over." Martha exhaled, a small, knowing smile crossing her lips. "I know." As the team continued working, the video replayed once more on the screen. This time, the world would see the truth, and this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. The security footage replayed on the large screen in Daniel's office, the same scene looping over and over. The young man in the gray hoodie dashing through the store, stuffing items into his pockets, sprinting out the door as the alarm blared. The moment that should have mattered. But instead, the security guard ignored the actual thief and locked onto Martha without hesitation. Daniel's hands rested on the polished table, his jaw clenched in restrained fury. His entire team was silent, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over the room. "This isn't just negligence," one of his attorneys finally said, shaking her head. "It's targeted discrimination. They didn't stop to check. They didn't even think twice. Martha sat in the chair beside her son, hands folded in her lap. She had watched the footage twice already, yet it still felt surreal seeing herself being blamed for a crime she didn't commit. Daniel turned to his team, his voice sharp. "How quickly can we get a press conference scheduled?" "An hour," his assistant responded immediately. "Good." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I want the public to see this. No more delays." Martha shifted slightly. She had never been the kind of woman to seek attention, but she knew this was bigger than her. This wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about exposing what happened. As Daniel's team moved swiftly, making calls and preparing statements, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and a smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. "They're panicking," he muttered. Martha lifted a brow. "Who is?" Daniel held up his phone, showing a text from an unknown number. "Judge Mercer wants to talk." Martha sat up straighter, watching as her son tapped a response. Before placing the phone to his ear, the call barely rang twice before it was answered. "Attorney General Lewis." Judge Mercer's voice came through, attempting to sound calm, but there was a clear strain in his tone. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding your mother's case." Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "A misunderstanding?" His voice was slow, deliberate. "Yes," Mercer said quickly. "Now that we have all the details, I'd like to make things right. Perhaps we can arrange a private discussion." Daniel's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You mean, off the record?" There was a pause on the other end. "I just believe this matter can be handled with discretion." Martha watched as her son exchanged a look with his legal team. They already knew the answer. "No," Daniel said smoothly. "We'll handle this in public." A sharp inhale sounded through the phone. Mercer's calm facade was slipping. "There's no need for this to escalate, Mr. Lewis." "Oh, it's already escalated," Daniel countered. "You denied my mother's rights. You pushed forward with a case that had no evidence. And now that the truth is out, you want to sweep it under the rug?" Mercer sighed, but this time it was laced with frustration. "Look, there are politics involved. I'm sure you understand." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What? I understand," he said, his tone deadly cold, "is that you and the prosecution tried to railroad an innocent woman into jail without a second thought. And now you're scrambling." Another pause. Then Mercer spoke again, his voice tighter than before. "What do you want?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Martha before responding. "Justice." Then he ended the call. The room was quiet for a beat before one of Daniel's attorneys let out a low whistle. "That man is sweating." "He should be," Daniel replied, "and he's not the only one." Martha exhaled slowly, pressing her hands against her lap to steady herself. "What happens now?" Daniel's gaze darkened with determination. "Now?" "We go to war." A small crowd of reporters had gathered outside Daniel's office building, their cameras flashing as they prepared for what was about to unfold. The podium stood at the front, a large screen behind it displaying the security footage from Jensen's grocery store. Martha stood beside Daniel, her heart pounding, but she refused to let her nerves show. She had spent her whole life being careful, staying quiet, making herself small, but not today. Daniel stepped up to the podium first, clearing his throat before speaking into the microphone. His voice was steady, commanding. Yesterday, my mother, Martha Lewis, was wrongfully arrested and charged for a crime she did not commit. His gaze swept across the crowd, his tone firm and unwavering. She was accused without evidence, forced through a corrupt system that was ready to discard her without a second thought, all because of an assumption. A murmur rippled through the reporters. Cameras clicked rapidly as the security footage began playing on the screen behind him. The entire world was about to see what had really happened. Daniel paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. But here's the part that should concern everyone in this country. This was not an accident. It was a choice. Martha's chest tightened at his words. He was right. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had chosen to ignore her, to let the system swallow her whole. Daniel continued. Judge Daniel Mercer, Prosecutor Thomas Grayson, and Detective William Owens all played a role in denying my mother's rights. They ignored clear evidence. They refused to review the footage. They set an outrageous bail for a crime that never happened. His eyes darkened, and now they will be held accountable. The murmurs grew louder. Some reporters exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Then, for the first time, Martha stepped forward. She took a breath, gripping the edges of the podium as she looked out at the cameras, her voice calm but unshakable. I want the world to understand something, she said. This isn't just about me. How many others have gone through the same thing? How many don't have someone powerful to stand up for them? How many names have been forgotten? The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, supporting her. Martha lifted her chin. I was lucky, she admitted. Most people aren't. As she stepped back, Daniel turned to the cameras once more. This is only the beginning, he promised, and as the screen behind him looped the footage again, the world watched, and this time they couldn't look away. The air outside the press conference was thick with tension, but Martha felt something she hadn't in days: relief. As she and Daniel stepped away from the podium, reporters still shouting questions, she realized just how much had changed in such a short time. Yesterday, she was invisible. Today, the entire country was watching. Daniel's team moved quickly, guiding them toward the building's exit as the security footage continued looping on the large screen behind them. The world had seen the truth. The proof of her wrongful arrest was undeniable. Inside the office, Daniel's phone was already buzzing. His assistants handed him updates. Judge Mercer had left his courthouse early. The prosecutor's office was in crisis mode. The police department had issued a vague statement about reevaluating proper procedures. They were all scrambling, desperate to escape the storm heading their way. Martha took a seat, her body still exhausted from everything she had been through, but her mind sharper than ever. She looked at her son, who was already planning his next move. What happens now? She asked, folding her hands in her lap. Daniel glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. Now, we hold them accountable. He turned the screen toward her. A new headline had just hit the news. Judge Daniel Mercer under investigation for judicial misconduct. Martha's breath caught. She scanned the article, her heart pounding. His history of rushing cases, dismissing evidence, and favoring prosecution over actual justice was finally being exposed. They found complaints against him dating back years, Daniel said. Cases just like yours. People with no voice, no defense. He thought he could get away with it forever. Martha exhaled slowly, shaking her head. How many others? Daniel met her gaze. Too many. Before she could respond, another assistant walked in, holding up a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." On the screen was a shaky cell phone video, filmed inside the police station. Detective Owens stood in the hallway, face flushed red, voice raised as he argued with another officer. "I don't care what the footage shows," Owens snapped. "She fit the description. You think anyone's going to care about some old woman?" Gasps filled the office as the video continued. Another officer tried to calm him down, but Owens shoved him away and stormed out. The video ended abruptly, but its impact was immediate. "That's it," Daniel murmured. "That's the final nail." Martha closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her emotions. She had known the system was flawed, but hearing Owens speak so carelessly about ruining her life made it all too real. Daniel turned to his team. "Send it to every major news station." One of his lawyers hesitated. "This will destroy his career." Daniel's face was unreadable as he replied, "Good." Martha sat back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since this nightmare started, she felt like justice was truly coming. Within hours, the fallout was unavoidable. Judge Mercer was placed on an indefinite suspension, pending a full investigation. Prosecutor Grayson released a public statement blaming the police department for misleading him, but no one believed him. The police chief announced that Detective Owens had been relieved of duty pending review. But Martha knew it wasn't enough. "These people aren't sorry," she told Daniel as they watched the news. "They're just sorry they got caught." Daniel nodded. "Which is why we're not stopping here." She looked at him surprised. "There's more." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're not the only one they did this to, Mom. There are dozens of cases like yours. People who were silenced, lost in the system. Some are still in jail, waiting for a trial that'll never be fair." Martha felt a deep ache in her chest. She had been lucky. But how many weren't? Daniel continued. "I'm launching an independent investigation into wrongful convictions in this city. Every case Judge Mercer pushed through without evidence. Every arrest Owens made without cause. It's all coming under review." Martha was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of it all. Then finally she nodded. "Good." Daniel smiled slightly. "I thought you'd say that." Martha sat on her small couch, a cup of tea in her hands, as she watched the television screen in front of her. The evening news was broadcasting a new segment, one about her. Martha Lewis, the 72-year-old woman wrongfully accused of shoplifting, has inspired a wave of investigations into judicial misconduct across the city. Attorney General Daniel Lewis has vowed to bring justice to those who were unfairly convicted, under the same system that nearly failed his mother. She shook her head, still unable to believe how much had changed in just a few days. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, a small smile on his face. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" "For the next step." She sighed, but stepped aside to let him in. "Daniel, I'm just an old woman who wanted to buy groceries. I didn't ask to be the face of a movement." He chuckled. "Maybe not, but people are listening to you now, and you've got a chance to make sure this never happens again." Martha glanced at the TV screen once more before looking back at her son. "All right," she said finally. Let's make sure they never forget." Daniel nodded. "That's the plan." As he sat down beside her, she realized something. She had spent her whole life trying to stay out of the way, to avoid drawing attention. But now she wasn't afraid to be seen, and as long as injustice existed, she wouldn't stop speaking up.